I have known Bill Gibson for almost 2 years now and have heard Bill talk about his experience as a counselor, a psychiatrist, psychologist for veterans, and you are in for a treat. I really enjoy listening to Bill share his experiences and his knowledge about war trauma and PTSD. Dr. Bill Gibson received his PhD in clinical psychology from St. John's University and is currently the clinical psychologist and neuropsychologist and the coordinator of the PTSD and SUD services at the Behavioral Health Outpatient Clinic. That's quite a title. At the Canandaigua Veterans Administration Medical Center at Canandaigua, New York. Bill, we're glad you're here. Let's welcome Bill Gibson.
Thank you, Coleman. Some of you know this story. This isn't exactly how I always planned to be dressed today. The airline lost my bag. So I read a novel once in which one of the characters works for this real high power company in New York City. The guy's invited to a party at his boss's house. And so he goes there and he's swimming in the swimming pool and he's having a good time, and his boss comes over and says, "Come here, I want to talk to you for a minute." And this guy had been preparing a presentation for the board on this big deal that the company was doing. So he gets out of the pool and he goes over, and there's his boss and the big boss and all these people, and they say to him, "Give us your presentation now." So he's standing there in his bathing suit, dripping, right, and giving his presentation. So in this beautiful sanctuary with these lovely people, let's all take a moment to be thankful that I'm not standing here in a bathing suit. It's good for me, it's good for you. The moral of the story is it could always be worse. So, that said, thank you, Coleman. Thank you to Rita, to the Soul Repair Center, for the folks here who have put this together. And thank you all for being here. Let me add my thanks to those of the people who have come before. We are all here because we care about veterans and active duty military personnel. These folks are our family, they are our friends, they are our neighbors, they are members of our congregation, they are our colleagues at work, they are us. They have served our country, and one way that we can repay them is to do all we can to really, truly help them come all the way home physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. Now, I've never been in combat. I've never even been in the military. So on the surface, it would seem that my life experience would really not provide me with very much of a common basis of experience to work with veterans with PTSD. Yet what draws me to this work and what makes it possible for me to do it with any degree of competence or integrity is one abiding fact: trauma touches everyone. My mother died about a month before my 6th birthday. Afterward, my dad and I moved around a lot. It wasn't unusual for me to be in 2 schools in the same academic year, for example. And through a series of misadventures, we lost almost all of the family memorabilia and pictures that we had. So this is the only baby picture I have of myself, and I have no pictures of my mother. In fact, I don't even remember what she looked like. I spent a lot of years trying to understand what this profound loss has meant to me in the course of my life and the person that I've become over the years. I continue to learn about that to this day. And I think the cliche about mental health professionals seems to apply to me, the idea that you go into clinical work to try to make sense of your own experience of loss and trauma, and I think that's absolutely true for me. Now, flash forward about 30 years. In addition to losing my mother, trauma touched me in a lot of other ways. Part of my doctoral studies, this is me graduating from St. John's University with my PhD and some of my crazy friends. The guy to my left in the picture in the red baseball cap is my good friend Daniel Carmen, who is actually a combat photographer in Vietnam. I did my internship, as Coleman said, at the VA Medical Center in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, and that's the first place I came across working with Vietnam veterans, and I heard their stories, and I first learned about PTSD. More recently, I lived in New Orleans for 10 years, and y'all might remember a couple of years ago we had a little storm in New Orleans. I, like many other people, was forced to evacuate ahead of Hurricane Katrina, and then watch from a distance, in my case in eastern Pennsylvania, uncertain of what I would face when I returned home after that storm. Sure, if we went around the room here, virtually everyone could tell a story about how trauma has touched their lives. This is especially true for you here in a community that recently suffered a significant trauma less than a couple of years ago. And anyone who has experienced trauma will tell you that there is a profound sense of before and after in their lives, a profound sense of how experiencing that trauma has changed their lives. For veterans who have experienced combat or non-combat trauma during their time in the military, their experiences have altered their interactions with the world and those around them. And even though the stressful situation that traumatized them may have taken place years in the past, as far back as World War II, for example, for many of those vets, those situations feel just as real and maybe even more real than what's happening to them today, right now. So as I have talked with veterans from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the first Gulf War, Bosnia, Kosovo, Somalia, veterans from the current conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, they've tried to describe to me what it feels like to have PTSD. The following descriptions and images give some sense of their experiences. My PTSD makes me feel like I'm standing in a vast open field in the middle of a torrential downpour. I can't focus on anything, things come toward me, but I can't tell if they're safe or dangerous. I can't see well enough to have a plan to escape or attack. It's utter chaos. I'm afraid to drive down the highway because I think that every dead animal or bag of garbage by the side of the road is camouflage for an IED that will explode when I drive past it. I can't walk down a crowded street or through a crowded mall because I constantly have to be on guard. I don't know who might be dangerous, and I have to be ready to react. I can't sit in a room unless I sit with my back to the wall and I can see all the exits. I can't go to bed at night without checking my perimeter and make sure the doors and windows are locked and there's no one hiding outside, and even then, I have trouble falling asleep. I feel like I'm a porcelain vase that was broken and pieced back together with glue, and you can see all the glue and the holes inside me where the chipped porcelain was never put back. I'm unable to hold emotions, which ends up leaving more gaping holes inside me. It's chasing all my friends away. The most important thing to know about PTSD is that for some people, experiencing a significant trauma results in persistent stress, a persistent stress response. It can be useful to think of PTSD as a fear response that a person learns in one situation and they generalize unnecessarily in most cases to other situations. Now, I'm sure, again, just about everybody in this room has experienced at least one event that might qualify as traumatic. Some sort of abuse, an assault, a traumatic kind of loss of something significant or someone significant to you. Many different types of trauma can potentially result in PTSD, whether it's a one-time experience or trauma repeated over time. For example, somebody who nearly drowns as a child may have an abiding and debilitating fear of the water, even though the person only suffered the trauma once. By the same token, a person may experience bullying on a daily basis through a school year or many school years. And while there's not one single incident that will necessarily stand out to them, that cumulative experience over time will haunt them afterward and affect their sense of safety and trust with other people. In both instances, people who develop PTSD, whether it's a one-time trauma or trauma over time, have persistent psychological and or physiological stress-related symptoms in similar situations. And the symptoms may then generalize to other situations. Now, the lifetime prevalence of PTSD in the general US population is about 7%. I think Rita mentioned this figure. By contrast, statistics indicate that the incidence is between 12 and 20% of folks who served in Iraq and Afghanistan who suffer from PTSD. However, it's really not possible to know what the real number is. And the general sense is that PTSD is probably way underreported. Many military personnel fear that there will be a negative effect on their career if they seek treatment, or if they're in the process of out-processing from the military, and people are asking them questions about PTSD. I was talking with Kyle Fauntleroy about this morning. They just want to go home. They don't want to tell anybody that they're having nightmares or that they're angry all the time, so they say they're fine. And other people may not even know what they're experiencing or know even how to talk about it or feel like they're able to seek treatment. So this 12 to 20% figure, in fact, there's some suggestion that the actual number of people experiencing PTSD may be double this range. So we're talking about 25 to 40%, which is a lot of people. We have a similar problem when we try to estimate rates of PTSD from previous conflicts. We do know that a significant number of people from Vietnam experienced PTSD, and it's likely that Korean and World War II era vets probably suffer similar rates of trauma. Although PTSD wasn't established as a formal psychiatric diagnosis until the early 1980s. Not only was there no formal diagnosis of PTSD prior to this, it often went unrecognized for what it really was, and it was not unusual for PTSD to be misdiagnosed as another psychiatric disorder. And when we look at records of conflicts going back thousands of years, as Rita said, back to the Bible, back to the Greek epics, back to the Bhagavad Gita, we see evidence of what we know as PTSD across time, across cultures. The reality is that war has always called forth a response from those who face it and experience it. So whether we call it PTSD, whether we call it combat fatigue or shell shock or soldier's heart, which is a term I learned recently from one of my vets, or whether we don't know what to call it, it's real. And war and the ripple effects from people's experiences of war and the trauma that creates leaves its mark on all who experience it and by extension, their families and society. Now, one of the problems or one of the barriers with PTSD is that, like any psychological or emotional problem, unlike physical injuries, people can't always see the damage. So they can't look at the person with the same empathy as they would with somebody who has a physical scar or physical injury. Nevertheless, the experiences and the symptoms and the feelings of those who suffer from PTSD are just as real and we hope would generate the same compassion. And in fact, the effects of PTSD may have some physical correlates in terms of brain structure and functioning. As this image here that you see shows, exposure to trauma seems to correlate with some changes in particular brain regions. So there's some underlying neurological basis. There's a lot of interesting research going on in this area. Part of the problem is we don't have studies where people have a CAT scan or an MRI prior to exposure to trauma and then post-exposure to trauma. So we see these changes, for example, between two brains, one with PTSD, one without PTSD, and we don't know, did that person's brain look like that before they experienced the trauma, or did the trauma actually cause changes in brain structure? But we know that there seems to be a correlation in brain structure and functioning in areas that involve processing memory, emotion, and interestingly, some areas in the frontal lobes that involve social functioning, the ability to make use of social supports. And when we think about the symptoms of PTSD, it makes perfect sense, right? Memory, emotion, and socialization. So there's some fascinating research going on in this area. Until recently, PTSD was classified diagnostically as an anxiety disorder. Currently, in the most recent iteration of DSM, it's classified, trauma disorders are classified by themselves, which emphasizes how they are somewhat different as a group of diagnoses from other psychiatric diagnoses. Now, the main symptoms of PTSD are, in fact, anxiety symptoms or anxiety-like symptoms, but that word really it minimizes the breadth and the depth of the experiences of people who suffer from PTSD. For most people, the world is basically a fairly safe place. We know that danger exists, we know that threats exist, but in most of our worlds, danger is an exception, not a rule. We don't think these things are going to happen to us. For people with PTSD, they know that the world is a place where bad things can happen to anybody at any time with no warning. And their experience leaves them feeling, therefore, constantly unsafe in the world. And so a simple trip to the grocery store, for example, can become an exercise of endurance of this intense anxiety and this intense symptomology, because they're always wondering if something's going to happen. An unexpected noise or a crowd of people will either lead to a new trauma or trigger the memory of a previous trauma or trigger a flare-up of symptoms. So for many people, symptoms will wax and wane over time, but many people don't find respite from any of this. So let's look at the anxiety symptoms of PTSD. PTSD anxiety symptoms arise from that fear of impending danger or impending trauma that will happen again. Imagine trying to get through each day with some or several or all of these mental, physical, and emotional reactions threatening to overwhelm you. Symptoms such as hypervigilance, mistrust, memory and concentration problems, anger that might make you violent at any time, jumpiness, insomnia, palpitations, shortness of breath, sweating, panic attacks, recurring nightmares, and flashbacks. Imagine trying to get through life with those things happening to you regularly. Likewise, other symptoms from PTSD may derive more from the deeper spiritual or existential wounds that the trauma brings about. Excuse me. While these symptoms are different from the anxiety-based symptoms, they're just as real and just as debilitating. These things include such things as depression, isolation or alienation. Substance abuse is a form of medication, which is something that I deal with frequently in my job, of course. A sense of despair, a sense of loss of meaning, and a loss of faith or spirituality. Now, as we have seen and will continue to discuss throughout the course of this conference, you look at these symptoms, and a lot of these symptoms overlap with what we now know as or refer to as moral injury, and what we typically see in moral injury. When some constellation of symptoms affects a person's basic thoughts, feelings, and actions, they might recognize that something is not right, but they may not know what it is, and they may not know what to do about it. They may not even know how to talk about it. Those of us around these folks, whether family, friends, neighbors, congregants, work colleagues, may only see what seems to be behavior that doesn't make a lot of sense, strange behaviors. One of our roles in supporting folks with PTSD is to maintain the awareness that these various symptoms can flare up and wax and wane, and to try to remember to respond to people with a sense of compassion. Now, as Coleman alluded in his introduction, I have been a psychologist for about 25 years, and I've spent about a third of my career, all told, with the VA. I've worked with people with PTSD arising from combat, from non-combat trauma, from civilian trauma, and in the past 7+ years at Canandaigua VA, I've worked more intensively with veterans with trauma. So I've really learned a great deal about this phenomenon over time, and I've learned particularly about all the different ways in which PTSD affects different areas of people's lives and functioning. First of all, it affects family relationships. Many veterans talk about experiencing symptoms so violent, nightmares, that they can't sleep with their partners anymore. They have to sleep in another room in the house or sleep on the couch because they'll wake up their partners screaming or crying or sometimes talking in a foreign language, Vietnamese or Arabic or some other language that they learned as part of their deployment. Or they'll wake up on top of their partner as if they're either fighting with their partner because they think their partner is attacking them or trying to protect them from something bad that's going to happen. Furthermore, many veterans report significant relationship problems and multiple marriages, multiple divorces because of a combination of things. The PTSD symptoms themselves, often substance abuse, and really at baseline, the inability to talk about their experience and to find a way to be truly emotionally intimate with their partners. One of the most distressing symptoms of PTSD that the people I work with talk about is that feeling of being emotionally cut off from the people that you love and not being able to connect with them the way that you would like to emotionally. This is very distressing to people. So for many vets, one of the most important things that we as family members and friends can do is simply to listen. You don't have to just be patient, have respect, listen to what the vet shares with you. Many vets have a really hard time, as Rita said, talking about their experiences because they fear they will either traumatize you by telling you their stories. As my vets say to me, I've got this stuff in my head, why in the world would I want to put it in somebody else's head? Or they fear that if they tell somebody about some of the things they've done or seen or experienced, the person will think less of them or think badly of them because of what they've heard. The single most important question never to ask a vet is, have you killed someone? Veterans universally hate this question, universally hate it. And I'll tell you the two best answers I've heard, the two best responses from veterans. One of my guys in my PTSD combat group is a Vietnam combat vet, and he said, that's between me and God. The other one is from a Navy vet who said to me, this guy was an Army vet who was in Iraq and Somalia. He said, I'll forgive you for asking me that question if you'll forgive me for not answering it, which I think is a very diplomatic way of turning aside that question. PTSD also affects basic daily activities. Many of the vets I know have found ways to cope with the sorts of difficulties getting around the necessities of functioning on a daily basis, from employing coping and anxiety management strategies that they might use, that they might learn in therapy, to altering their routines to avoid triggers. For example, one of my vets was a Navy vet from Vietnam, and some of you might remember the aircraft carrier Kitty Hawk. There was a race riot on the Kitty Hawk in the early 1970s. My vet was on the Kitty Hawk and experienced a trauma as part of that riot. He was a bad alcoholic for a long time. He got sober, thank God, but he still has tremendous trauma and is very anxious around crowds. So he can only go grocery shopping at 3 o'clock in the morning when nobody's at the store. That's the only time that he feels safe going to the store. Other people search for other kinds of accommodations. One of my guys who's an Iraq vet had gotten to the point where he was able to go to these auto auctions for a friend of his. He was a mechanic, and he would go down and scope out these cars. And he was really enjoying this, and he would be there for a while, and he would be anxious, and then he'd go outside for a while, and he'd calm down, then he'd go back in. But he stopped going, because one day he was at the auto auction, and he heard two men standing near him speaking in Arabic to each other. And he left, and he never went back. He couldn't go back. It was too distressing to him. This same vet is the one that taught me about a particular anxiety that Iraq and Afghanistan vets have about driving. He has a particular thing about guardrails. Apparently, and I didn't know this for a long time, guardrails were a favorite place for the bad guys to place IEDs. So you drive past guardrails on a road, and this guy would get very anxious about that. So he has trouble driving. While many vets have difficulty getting through their daily lives and wind up maybe seeking some form of professional help, whether it's psychotherapy or medication or both, family and friends can also help. We can ask, how can I help you be less anxious in this situation? For example, the vet that I just mentioned with the trouble driving, his wife has become a great support to him. When they're riding together and she sees him getting anxious, she can talk him down a little bit. Other things to do are to be sensitive, particularly around anniversary times of the year when the person experienced particular traumatic events, either combat or it was the time that they deployed, or any event that to them might cause an exacerbation of symptoms. Be more sensitive during those times. Don't be surprised if the person becomes more irritable, the person withdraws, and try to be supportive, particularly during these times when the symptoms may flare up. PTSD can affect how people function at work. One of my guys, I didn't see him very often, and it's too bad because he was really an interesting guy. He had a long way to travel, and he couldn't make appointments very well. But he got this job as a member of the hostage rescue team for the state of New York. And this was the coolest thing. This was the dream job for this guy. The problem was he had a bad alcohol problem, and he couldn't sleep, and he missed work. And he was in danger of potentially losing this job because his symptoms were such that he could not manage them very well, and it was jeopardizing his employment. One of my other guys, he was an Afghan vet, was a sergeant in the Army, was a prison guard and corrections officer. And his fellow corrections officers thought that his startle response was kind of amusing. So they would hide behind doors and things and jump out and scare this guy to watch him freak out. And this was all fun and games until one day somebody did this and he snapped and he grabbed the person by the throat, put them up against the wall, and no one ever did that to him again. One of the best things employers can do is to educate their whole staff about PTSD. Certainly harassing anybody in the workplace for any reason is not appropriate, but sensitivity to veteran coworkers' issues is really critical. And it's important for employers and coworkers to be flexible about things like, for example, exposure to lots of people, exposure to noise, predictability and safety in the work environment. And again, when it's possible in the job site, be sensitive to things like anniversary times. The person may wind up missing more work during that time because they have a hard time coping. And also, if they're in treatment, be sensitive about things like they need to make appointments and try to be flexible with work schedules. These are some ways that employers can help with vets with PTSD. Certainly, PTSD can affect spirituality very profoundly. Many vets talk about wanting to go to church, but they don't feel comfortable going to church because they don't feel comfortable sitting in a room with a bunch of people they don't know and having people at their back. So if they can't sit at the back by the exits, they often don't go. The vets I talked to use some very poignant terms to talk about their spiritual struggles. One vet described himself to me as being spiritually bereft. I don't know if I've ever heard a sadder term in my life. Other vets talk about having, an argument with God or falling out with God. One Vietnam vet who grew up an observant Catholic and a very religious man never saw combat, but saw such suffering among the women and children in Vietnam that he stopped going to church for 40 years. And he's only just starting to try to reconnect with his faith. Now, this is something we'll talk about more throughout the course of the conference this afternoon and tomorrow particularly. But one of the things we can do as congregants and clergy can do is to try to figure out a way to welcome vets and their families into our congregations. Something as simple logistically as making spaces at the back of the sanctuary or spaces close to the exits where vets can sit, and if they need to duck out, they can step out. We did this in North Carolina back in the spring. We did one of these conferences, and a pastor came up to me afterward, this young woman, and said, "You finally helped me understand something about my congregation." She had a large population in her church of Montagnards, and those of you who know about Vietnam know that the Montagnards fought very bravely with American troops. And she said they all sat at the back of the church. They all sat together in the back, and there was this one guy that sat way in the back with his back to the wall right by the door. And she found out that he was the man who had the most intensive combat experience. She said, I never understood why they all sat back there together. Now I understand. Something simple logistically is something like that. Consider making the church particularly veteran-friendly. Sponsor a veteran-specific 12-step group, AA, NA, something like that. Or other meetings that are veteran-friendly. Or developing, I always thought it would be really neat to develop a mentorship program in churches where veterans, either from the same conflict or previous conflict eras, their families could work with families of vets coming back from Iraq or Afghanistan, or people with non-combat trauma, to kind of help bring them into the church family and help them adjust to church life. Many veterans obviously may have some significant questions about their faith, or again, may have tremendous anger at God and not quite know what to do with that or how to talk about that. Now, we can help them by being prepared for some very serious and very frank discussions about some of the issues we're talking about here, about the morality and the ethics of what they dealt with and how it feels to them personally. And to not try to provide easy answers, but to listen compassionately and to find a way to help the person reconcile with not only their own moral sense, but the moral community, potentially through not only these conversations, but symbols or rituals. And again, this is something we'll talk more about over the course of the conference here. And certainly, PTSD affects communities in a couple of different ways. We know, obviously, from what we're talking about here, that in our society, individuals with PTSD often feel very, very marginalized in society. This not only takes a toll on them, but it takes a toll on, like a ripple effect, the circles around them. So that's one way PTSD affects communities. But it can also affect communities as a whole. Communities as a whole can suffer from PTSD from widespread trauma. Think of Hiroshima after World War II. Think of Homestead, Florida after Hurricane Andrew many, many years ago. Think about New York City after September 11th. In communities, as with individuals, the symptoms are similar. Anger, loss, anxiety, that sense of hypervigilance, sense of fear, the sense of hopelessness, the struggle to make sense of the senseless that happens at the community level can feel overwhelming to people. And certainly, y'all here in Midland know far more about community level trauma than any community should ever have to know. I've read accounts of what happened here a couple of years ago, and I can only begin to imagine what it must have felt like here when that tragedy happened and after that tragedy. But I also hope that you're beginning to see the possibility for healing at the community level. After a trauma, communities can come together to offer shared understanding. They can grieve together, find a way to find hope again. We can find solace in remembering together, and we can find solace and strength in the rituals that help us memorialize and rebuild. Over time, with this kind of support, this kind of love, this kind of care for one another, healing can occur, both at the individual level and at the community level. When veterans can talk to their families, when they can talk to their bosses, they can talk to their coworkers, they can talk to their spiritual leaders about their experiences, when people can listen with respect and compassion, again, healing really can happen. On a recent Thanksgiving, one of my patients was finally able to talk with his wife and his parents at Thanksgiving dinner about some of what he experienced in Iraq, including a traumatic event that happened to him on Thanksgiving Day after he'd been in country about 2 months. For several years, he'd been deployed in 2004, so this was a long time. For several years, he avoided talking about these things for the reason that we talked about. One, because he didn't want to upset his family with hearing stories that upset him, and also he was worried that they might think of less of him for the things that happened to him, what he did, what he didn't do, what he observed. And he was rather taken aback because when he finally got up the courage to talk to his family about this, his mother started to cry, and his wife started to cry. And his father just shook his head and told his son that he was a hero. Now, my patient is not comfortable being called a hero, but he was incredibly relieved and incredibly gratified at his family's response. And since this conversation, he's been able to talk more with his family, with his wife, with his parents, with his brother about some of his experiences. And I have been able to see how this has helped him heal from the things he's experienced. Another crucial relationship with this man, this same patient, is his dog. He has a pit bull mix named Oscar, who's a certified PTSD dog, and he brings Oscar with him to some of his sessions. I haven't seen Oscar in a while. I have dog treats in my drawer because my patients bring their dogs. I like that. And when he first started to come and he brought Oscar, he was anxious a lot when he talked about traumatic events. And Oscar would sense his anxiety, and he would get up on his hind legs, he'd put his paws on my patient's shoulder, and he would lick his face. And my patient would say, "It's okay, boy, it's okay, I'm fine." And the dog would sit down, but he'd keep his eyes on him. And one of my favorite moments in therapy with this guy, and this happened after I'd been seeing him for several months, is Oscar, he came in one day with Oscar, and Oscar came over, he laid down next to my chair, and he went to sleep. And it was like he said, "Okay, I know this is a safe place, I know my person is okay, I can stand down for a while." This is a very profound moment for me. Another patient, also a Vietnam veteran, spent a lot of time in our sessions talking about his anger at God and grieving his lost years of spiritual connection. After we processed some of this, and I'm not clergy, I'm not trained as a theologian, but I have worked in the area of spirituality and psychotherapy since I did my dissertation in this 25 years ago before it was fashionable. And we got to a point where he was able to talk to a pastor friend of his about these feelings and have some really good conversations. And so he started attending church again. And he's still feeling angry, he's still dealing with it, but he's now has a different way of trying to make sense of some of the things that have happened to him and dealing with some of the things he saw. And he's addressing these feelings in conversation, not in isolation, which is really, really crucial. One way in which communities can foster healing from a community-level tragedy is to erect or place some sort of temporary or permanent memorial. And we see these temporary memorials in various places, right? Car accidents or murders in the city where there's an outpouring of comfort items and pictures of the person who we are remembering. Permanent memorials include sculptures like the installation of the Oklahoma City bombing site, the World Trade Center site, and certainly the conflict-specific memorials, the wall that we just saw in the previous slide, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, the World War II Memorial, the Korean Memorial in Washington, D.C., and other places. Human beings are very visual creatures, and sometimes words just aren't enough for us to get us to pay attention. So a memorial can provide a visual reminder, a visual hook, that something profound has happened in this place. And it helps the person remember this place is sanctioned and sanctified. It's a place to reflect and remember. And they also remind us, and this is really, really crucial, any place where a tragedy has taken place, especially the tragedy of a loss of life, is, in a sense, hallowed ground, and we need to remember and reverence that space. Now, there are certainly various treatments for post-traumatic stress disorder, and medication can be helpful for veterans to treat anxiety, depression, nightmares. There are several psychological treatments for PTSD. There are two in particular that are referred to as evidence-based practices because they have a certain amount of research behind them that the VA uses and endorses as the gold standard for PTSD treatment, one called cognitive processing therapy, the other one called prolonged exposure. These can work very effectively to help treat the anxiety-based symptoms of PTSD primarily by helping the person think differently about what happened to them and giving them some tools and teaching them techniques to help cope better with anxiety and stress. And they can be very, very effective in working with those symptoms. But even the people in the VA that endorse these treatments will say that these treatments don't necessarily touch everything within people with PTSD. They can certainly help with flashbacks, jumpiness, insomnia, panic attacks, mental, physical, emotional symptoms. But they don't necessarily touch the deeper issues that come along with PTSD. Issues having to do with things like identity and meaning and spirituality and traumatic loss. Other therapies might get at this better. For example, apropos my patient with a dog, there are treatments that pair veterans with animals, cats, dogs, horses, dolphins, I read in one study. The idea that forming a bond with an animal, forming a healing relationship with an animal, in some cases caring for the animal, can be very healing and provide also a sense of emotional connection and meaning and purpose. I remember hearing a story several years ago about this program and I think it's in upstate New York. I was living in Louisiana at the time, where they had prisoners taking care of horses. And they had this guy that was a real bad guy, you know, and he's in the stall with a horse. And the horse, he was doing something and the horse wasn't happy about it. The horse pinned him against the wall. And those of you who work with horses know, if a horse wants you to stay someplace, you're going to stay there, right? And the guy said, I had this epiphany. I suddenly realized I wasn't the baddest person in the stall. And so this kind of connection with an animal, this kind of relationship can be profoundly healing to people. Other media, and again, we'll talk about this throughout the course of this conference, writing, painting, drama, music, drumming, can help people with PTSD express feelings and talk about things in channels other than just words, just verbal channels. So the next generation of treatments, we hope, will take the best of what the evidence-based practices have to offer and also incorporate these other aspects of treatment to help touch the deeper moral issues. Okay. Recognize who this is, right? I don't know how many of you all saw the movie Guardians of the Galaxy. This is a character in Guardians of the Galaxy, and some of you, even if you haven't seen the movie, you might have seen his picture. This character's name is Groot, right? He's like a big tree. And throughout the movie, he has only one line, and anything anyone says to him, they ask him a question, in any situation, he only has one line in response to everything. He says, I am Groot, right? It's really kind of a cool character. There's a scene in the movie, I won't spoil it for you in case you want to see it, toward the end of the movie where he puts himself in jeopardy, in peril to save his friends. And at that point in the movie, for the first time, he says, we are Groot. Now, like Groot, like countless people in diverse times, diverse cultures, diverse places, we want to help and protect those we love, those who are important to us. Our role is to do what we can to help those who suffer from PTSD heal and to show them that they are still loved, that they are still part of the greater whole in the greater community, despite the experiences they've had, which leave them feeling so cut off from everyone else. When we do this, we are not just helping them. We are helping ourselves. We're helping all of society, all of the community. Veterans and active duty service personnel need to be able to talk about their experiences with people who knew them before their traumatic experiences. And with time and support, they might be able to find a way to cope with what's happened to them and what they've experienced and to find a way to move forward in their lives. Just as they left behind what was comfortable and secure and familiar to them to serve their country and to protect us all, it is our responsibility to them to step outside what is comfortable and familiar to us, to listen to their stories, to acknowledge and share their pain, and help them find healing because, once again, they are us. Organizations like the Soul Repair Center have begun this work. You all here and in other communities around the country are doing this work. And by attending this conference, you are saying that with more belief, with knowledge, and with community support, we can all truly help our veterans come all the way home, spiritually, mentally, emotionally, physically. Thank you. Thank you. Now we have some time here, and I'd like to do a little Q&A, a little discussion. This is the best part. Okay, I get really sick of hearing myself talk, but I suspect there's a tremendous amount of wisdom and knowledge and experience in this room. So if you have questions, I'll try to answer them. If you have experiences you want to share or thoughts about any of the stuff I talked about or anything here, feel free. Let's start a discussion. Yes?
I'll come to you with the mic because we are recording these, and so we want to be sure we get all the questions, and so that everyone in the room can hear on mic.
Thank you, Coleman.
Wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I have 4 questions. I will ask one.
Okay. We can talk about the other ones if you wish later. That's, I'll be around, so sure.
Please. With regard to the certified PTSD dog,
Right.
getting a dog that's been trained by somebody else can be very expensive.
Yes.
Are there mechanisms in place or opportunities for vets to train their own dogs and get that certification status?
There are, as a matter of fact. I am learning about this as time goes on. I get this question from time to time. And actually, one of my other patients in my PTSD combat group was telling me about this. There are a couple of places that you can go, and there are organizations that they pay for all of this, so the vet doesn't have any money out of pocket. You go, you meet the dog, you and the dog sort of choose each other, and there's this very intensive period where you train the dog bonds with you, and then you take that dog home. So there are places that you can do that, and let's hook up sometime between now and the end of the conference. I'll give you my card, give me your contact information. I will get the specifics of that and send that to you if you want me to. Okay, fabulous. Okay. Yeah, that's the coolest thing, because you're right. You get a dog that somebody else has trained, that's not necessarily bad, but it's not the same sort of bonding experience as working with your own animals. So I think that's fabulous, and whoever put that together and is paying for it, God bless them. So, yeah. Hi.
This is regarding screening soldiers who might be at risk for PTSD prior to deployment and when they return from deployment. That's part of what I do professionally.
Oh,
and,
bless your heart. Okay.
Yeah, there's a very specific set of questions that the soldiers are asked in the interview process.
Right.
Do you have a sense of how effective that screening is? Because, of course, I don't get to see the end result of that.
Right.
And I have some mixed feelings about it. Any comments?
Yeah, we all get to see, like, don't go too far with the mic. I want to ask her a couple of questions, too. We only get to see one piece of it, right? We don't get to see the whole story. Could you talk a little bit about the questions that you ask as part of the screening? Because I think that would be helpful for people to hear. I have a little sense of this, but I don't know it at that level of detail.
Well, the questions are highly standardized. A lot of them are following the DSM categories.
Try to establish like a pre-existing psychological
Right.
condition or something.
Exactly.
Or, yeah.
And
Okay.
soldiers have to answer the questions yes or no.
Okay.
On a computer, and then meet with a medical provider afterward to discuss their responses.
Right.
To get further information, and then based on those responses, determine whether the soldier needs perhaps to either one, not deploy, or two, go get some further evaluation before deploying, or after being triaged after they've come home.
Okay. Okay.
Questions everything from, in the last month, have you had any thoughts that you'd be better off dead or hurting yourself in some way? In the last month, have you thought that you might hurt or lose control with someone else?
Right.
Those are like some of the basic, those are the top questions.
Gotcha. And then things like, are you anxious? Are you depressed? Have you ever been psychiatrically treated before, et cetera, et cetera?
Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Those
Okay.
They're very routine, standard screening. But the problem is I never, and I don't know, I'm not aware of any really good data regarding how effective these questions really are at, quote unquote, weeding out or selecting those soldiers who truly are at risk.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you for the education there, too. There may be data. If there is, I don't know it, and I apologize. That's probably something I should know. This is something that's never been done before. And this is part of what we continue to learn from Vietnam era, the first Gulf War, and other conflicts we've been involved in, Somalia, Kosovo, Bosnia, et cetera, that some people may be predisposed to responding to stressful situations by developing PTSD, whereas others, and Rita has said this too, put two people in the same situation, and she was talking about moral injury, but it's true for PTSD. One person might be traumatized, the other person might not. Remember, even if we take the higher level estimates of PTSD, it may be, say, 40 or 50%. That essentially means you flip a coin, right? PTSD, no PTSD. So there's some thought that some people are potentially at greater risk for trauma. Certainly people, I would think, with pre-existing psychiatric conditions might be, although not necessarily. Someone that has experienced a previous trauma, and I have to tell you, and this is purely anecdotal, this is just little old me, I'm not, like a big researcher like Brett Litz in Boston or something. Every veteran that I have talked to with PTSD has some prior trauma in their history. It can be a loss, it can be being sexually abused as a child, it can be growing up in an abusive or assaultive family. I see people nodding their heads, right? I mean, this sounds like this is other people's experience. So there's some suggestion that prior exposure to trauma makes you more vulnerable to combat trauma. There's some suggestion that certain kinds of personality structures and configurations may make you more predisposed. One of the things that people that are doing their neurobiological research are looking at is, are there people who are neurologically more predisposed because the brain areas that process affective functioning and memory and the frontal functions that involve the ability to use social support and talk about things with other people, if they are not as functional in those areas, are those people at greater risk for trauma? That's very much in its infancy. I don't know what the outcome of that is. I would love to know what the data is, and probably DOD has it somewhere. You know what the great thing about that is, though? And I know that y'all are sitting down because this is going to be a big shocker to you. People lie, right? People lie. I was talking with Kyle about this morning, Kyle Fauntleroy. These guys come back from out processing, right? And they're going through Fort Drum, which is the big center near me in upstate New York. And people are asking them, do you have nightmares? Do you have flashbacks? Do you blah, blah, blah? And what are you going to say? You want to go home and be with your family. And this person says, if you answer these questions, we're going to do more stuff with you. Are you going to say to them, yeah, I have nightmares? And you're going to say, no, I'm fine. Get me out of here. So I think certainly response bias is the polite way to say it. So I would love to know what those data are, and I'm sure they're out there someplace. And again, if you want to give me your card or your contact information, I will ask my colleagues who know more about this sort of stuff than I do, and maybe I can send you a couple links or something like that.
Thank you.
Sure, okay. There's some person right behind you wants the mic. You can just pass it back there, yeah.
Hi, I'm Dr. Marcia Norton, and I just wanted to share that with the National Center for PTSD and Dr. Steve Southwick with Yale University, he has ongoing research with Fort Drum. They are using MRIs of soldiers pre-deployment.
Oh, fabulous.
And post-deployment.
Excellent.
And yes, you see mainly the changes in the amygdala.
Okay.
So,
and the amygdala is the part of the brain that involves
right,
processing affect and emotional processing.
Right,
yeah.
and they were doing that even when I was there, and I left in 2006.
Wow, I'm really behind the
Yeah,
times.
we
How
had
about
just
that?
started that.
Cool.
So, yeah.
So these are actual changes. These are not people that have previously existing structural differences. We know that experience changes our brain. If you look at functional neuroimaging of somebody who's on an antidepressant medication and somebody who's in therapy for depression, and you do functional neuroimaging over time, the person that's in therapy that's not on medication, their brains show the same neurophysiological changes in neurotransmitter production and processing as the person that's on medication. So we know that experience changes our brains. And I wasn't aware that there was actually study with neuroimaging. That is so cool.
Yeah, and Dr. Steve Southwick is a neuropsychiatrist.
Okay.
Went to Yale Medical
Okay.
And then Colonel Paul Morrissey is also in on that project. And
Okay.
he was a psychiatrist, active duty U.S. Army.
Fabulous. That's really cool. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. I feel like that's something I should have known. Good heavens. I'm fighting on how much I don't know today. Thank you, I appreciate that. Yeah, that's true, right? Exactly, good point. Hi.
Hi, I'm interested in timing, in the sense of that after World War II, soldiers from the South Pacific and Europe had to get on a boat, and it took them a week or two to get home. Whereas in Vietnam, you could be in the jungle one day and in a matter of 3 or 4 days,
Right.
be at home in your own bed.
Yep.
Same with Iraq, Afghanistan. Is
Yep.
there research to show that maybe we need to do a better job debriefing and buffering before we turn them loose?
There is some interesting research done in World War II by a gentleman who is an Army historian, and he was an active duty colonel. Is it Samuel Marshall? Does that name sound right to people? Yeah. And who looked at taking soldiers, units who had just been in combat action, and this is World War II, pulling them off the field, sitting them down together, having them start to talk about what happened right away. That this actually seemed to be beneficial not only for unit cohesion, but also for trauma processing at the time. And I have heard that a lot from guys, the Vietnam guys. I'm in the bush one day, 48 hours later, I'm walking through San Francisco Airport, and talk about trying to wrap your mind around something. I think and again, we learned a lot from Vietnam and the mistakes we made with Vietnam-era vets, and that's one of the reasons why they try to do some different out-processing things than they used to do in Vietnam. One of the things that Rita will probably talk about at some point over the course of the conference is a project they want to work on. One of the things she says is, the Army, the Navy, the Marines, everybody puts you through boot camp, right? But they never put you through a reverse boot camp to come back to society. So they're looking at doing a little pilot program to do something like that for people coming back with them and their families, to help them kind of ease back into the world a little bit. So there may be literature out there about that. Again, I can't quote it to you chapter and verse, but you may know what it is. So talk to this nice lady over here. She can probably answer it better than I can.
Rita and Charles Luke are actually going to talk about that program in their workshop this afternoon.
Fabulous.
So if you're interested in that,
Fabulous.
check out that workshop.
Yeah.
I just wanted to follow up with your question about the pre-deployment health assessment. You have one phase of it, the sitting down in front of the computer and checking off lists, and you may or may not be authentic in your responses. Remember that military life is 90% training, and it's all training, and it's all assessment from day one of boot camp all the way to the moment you get on the airplane, the ship, whatever. And there are assessments along the way. So it's the post-deployment health assessment is a little bit trickier, and authenticity is a little bit easier to evade because folks just want to go home and may not be the right answer. So at least in the Navy and Marine Corps, we are working on out-processing procedures that address what you're speaking of, because we did learn a lot from World War II with the boat ride home, where everybody was together and could process out together. We learned a lot. We didn't execute what we learned in all cases with the individual augmentation and some of the practices we have now, but we are getting back to what we learned.
Thank you, Kyle.
Hi. Hi.
Hi.
I've been separated from the Army since 2006, and as I'm listening, I feel the need to make a distinction between treating and diagnosing PTSD for veterans and what it means for active duty personnel. I'm wondering, from your perspective in the VA, if you see problematic areas on the active duty side, because I think the focus there, when I was in, was about returning to duty, where
Right.
the veteran is returning to society. And I'm just wondering if you have any comments on that.
I do have some thoughts on it. I'd like to hear Kyle, if you don't mind commenting too. One of the things that the military does now that they did not do before is, or did not do as consistently before, is they have what are called combat stress teams that are posted out in the field with combat units, and they are mental health professionals, trained people. For example, one of the guys at Canandaigua VA as a clinical social worker has done 2 tours with a combat stress team, and you probably knew about those folks when you were in the field. So there is an attempt anyway to have people available in deployment who a soldier, a Marine, a Navy person, a sailor can go to and say, look, I'm having some problems here. There are a couple of issues with that. One is there is still a lot of stigma about admitting to any kind of emotional or mental health difficulty. Anybody who wants to make the military their career will be loath to go talk to a mental health professional because they're afraid this is going to go on my file, this is going to go on my record, I'm not going to get promoted, I'm not going to advance, and furthermore, people are not going to trust me because they're going to think I'm crazy or I'm fragile. People who don't even plan to make the military their career are still going to be hesitant to do it because of the issue of trust and being labeled as there's something wrong with you. I have heard mixed things about the combat stress teams. Some people have said they were great, they were fabulous, I really loved having those people available. Other people have said to me, you know, they were there, but they were like off in an office someplace. They didn't really mix with us. And so we didn't feel like they were part of us. I didn't feel like it was somebody I could go talk to, because even though they had all the gear and they walked around like they were soldiers like me, I didn't feel like I could connect with that person. One way that people get around this, and we've talked about this in previous settings, and Kyle and I, again, we're talking about this morning. If you talk to the chaplain when you're active duty military, that is absolutely confidential. No one can get that out of your record, really. And I mean, there may be exceptions, because there are always exceptions, but as far as I know, it's the sacrament of the confessional, basically. So people will go talk to the chaplain and tell them essentially about mental health issues, rather than talking to a medical person or a mental health person. And chaplains are variably trained and variably comfortable with their ability to deal with that stuff. One of the things the VA is doing now is trying to create a better collaboration between the chaplain service and the mental health service so that we can cross-refer to each other and sort of understand what each other do. I don't know, and DOD is involved in that as well. I've been to a couple meetings and been on a couple of list discussions about that. So I think, and again, when people come out, even now you think, well, PTSD is all over the news. People know what it is. How could you not know what PTSD is, especially if you're in the service, right? One of my patients who's in my PTSD combat group, who was in the Army for 12 years, was in multiple deployments all around the world, gets out of the service, comes to Canandaigua VA for physical problems, knee problems and shoulder problems, and we do our routine screenings, right? This guy's not even 40 years old. I think he's 39 now. And he does the screening, and the nurse comes out and says, well, Mr. So-and-so, you know, according to our screening here, you may potentially have post-traumatic stress disorder, and we'd like you to talk to one of our counselors about this. And his response was, and I didn't think he was joking when he said this, his response was, well, PTSD, what is that? Is it catching? Right? So this guy didn't know that he had PTSD. So there's that level of I feel these things and I don't know what to call them and I don't know how to talk about them, so I'm just not gonna. Then there's the part that says I don't want to talk about them because I don't want to be labeled or I don't want people to look at me differently. And I think we have that both active duty and people that are discharged. Now that's a very long and convoluted answer to your question. Does that even begin to address your question? Or, okay, I'm going to talk from the active duty side especially.
We are, to answer your question, in the last 5 or 6 years, they have added or augmented care teams with what they call military family life counselors who are deployable, and resiliency counselors who are also deploying downrange with units. what we found, and Bill has addressed this, and Newell, tune into this. Where's Jaretta? Tune into this. We're finding that these secular counselors are experiencing exactly what Bill said. They're not getting the clientele that they expect because folks are coming to chaplains. We don't have enough chaplains. We don't have enough chaplains in the military, especially those who are CPE trained at any level, to deal with these folks. They're coming to chaplains because of pastoral privilege, confidentiality, holding information sacred. We're throwing a lot of money at secular clinicians, and they're doing a good work. They really are. But folks are still coming to chaplains first.
Thank you, Kyle. We have time for maybe a couple more questions. It's almost noon. Don't want to keep anybody from lunch.
My daughter is a Navy mental health provider, and she was part of the Warrior Transition Program in Kuwait. She spent 7 months there.
Cool.
One of her comments to as many family members and civilians as she could make it was that we owe the Warrior Transition Programs in Kuwait for the Navy and Germany for other branches of the military to our Vietnam veterans who returned and said, you can't do this to anybody ever again.
That's fabulous.
In Western New York, first in Buffalo, New York, was the first veterans court so that those who were suffering from seeing a bag of garbage and driving erratically who would get picked up, if they went to the veterans court and followed a year-long proscribed or had a DUI, but followed a year-long prescribed court-ordered program, then whatever the infraction was expunged from their records.
Yeah.
And again, this was started by the Buffalo Vietnam Veterans chapter there. So there are a lot of things that are really happening. One of the other current active duty things that my daughter shared, she's just leaving Hawaii tomorrow, which is after 3 years. I don't know how she's going to handle Virginia. But there is an effort started by Navy chaplains to prepare crews who are going on submarines for what that's about. So there is before your first submarine experience, there is a program, and they included the mental health as well as the chaplain services in presenting that.
Excellent. Yeah, I hear that a lot from my PTSD group. I've got sort of a mixed cohort. I've got a bunch of Vietnam vets. I got some folks from the first Gulf War, and I've got some OEF, OAF people, and then this one guy who's kind of been everywhere. And there's this constant sense of the debt that we owe to Vietnam veterans for coming back and raising hell and making us aware of these things so that we're trying to do some things better now than we did 30 years ago with variable success. But at least we're trying. Thank you for mentioning the Veterans Court, too, which I think is a fabulous thing. And in Rochester, where I'm from, and we're from the same area, some of my patients have been involved in that, and it's so wonderful. And it's not special treatment. It's a recognition that this person is not entirely themselves in doing these things, and that we need to acknowledge that and give them a chance to make it right through treatment rather than penalizing them as a bad person. So I think that's a fabulous development. Yeah, hi.
I was going to say that Midland County actually put in for a grant for the Veterans Court, but we could not get a judge that was willing to sit on it.
Oh my.
He didn't like the idea of having to report higher up to Austin.
Interesting.
And so right now Midland County is actually pursuing trying to get a veterans docket. Taylor County, which is Abilene, has a similar thing where the judge actually doesn't have to report up. He just has to be able to say, yes, this is a veteran issue. And then part of my program is that we provide the mentors for the veterans docket or the veterans court.
Right. And that mentorship is part of what makes it so important, because it is a real personal connection. Wow, that's great. That's great. It's very interesting that the judge would have that response. That's why they're judges, right? Hi.
Hi. I'm a community college instructor, and I'm wondering if there's any research on PTSD and learning, or any programs that have worked to help people with PTSD in colleges. PTSD
and learning, not PTSD from like being in Catholic school necessarily. Okay. PTSD and its effects on the person's capacity to benefit from education and that. You know, there is a tremendous push now to help veterans who want to go back to school return, and I don't know if you have it in your institution, but where I'm from, Monroe Community College and Finger Lakes Community College, which are in the Rochester and Canandaigua areas, we have veteran liaisons on site on campus. We have people whose specific job it is to work with veterans and help them adjust to college life at the community college level. Our vocational counselors also particularly work a lot with educational type stuff. And so there's a real push to help people get back into the academic environment. And again, I'm sorry, I sound like a broken record. I'm sure someone is doing research on that. I don't know off the top of my head what it is, but I think that would be fascinating, because if we think about, well, I'll tell you a couple of stories though. My one patient, the guy who was in the Army for 12 years, who got out and didn't know he had PTSD, he's really a smart guy. He was a math major. I mean, he's really smarter than I am. And he was in classes, and his fellow students and some of his professors, when they found out he was in the Army, would kind of start to give him grief about this, about how could you do this, and how could you, you know. And he left school because he said, I don't want to be around those people, right? Now, another thing is the PTSD symptomatology that would make it hard for you to sit in a room, potentially with no windows, and with a bunch of people you don't know, and sit there and be comfortable and listen. So there's this sort of the psychiatric, psychological symptomatology. And then we would have to wonder, too, about the neurobiological underpinnings of this and whether it would affect processing in such a way that it would affect learning and retention. So there's probably some fascinating research to be done there, and there may be people doing it. That's a really good question. Yeah, thank you.